Ever slammed up against a deadline, found the perfect code library, and thought, problem solved? But what if you're building an app meant to scale? Like, really scale?
That's where things get interesting.
Today's deep dive is all about those hidden costs, straight from George Lioros's Mobile Apps at Scale. We're talking third-party code and the gotchas that only pop up when you've got millions of users.
It's a whole different ballgame.
Expert speaker, walk us through this. What's the first thing developers should even be thinking about before they hit install on that shiny new library?
Okay, imagine this. You're not building a little app, you're building a digital skyscraper. Each library, each SDK, it's like bringing in a prefabbed floor, right?
That's convenient.
Sure, but that prefab better be up to code, or your whole skyscraper as well.
Going down.
Exactly. And Oros does not mess around when it comes to security risks. It's not just, does it work? It's who else might be coming along for the ride.
So vetting is key. It's like a background check for your code.
Think about it. One outdated library, especially one that touches sensitive data network calls, storage that's a hacker's dream.
And at scale, a small vulnerability becomes a huge breach.
Suddenly you're not fixing code, you're on the phone with lawyers.
It's easy to get caught up in that move fast and break things mentality.
Right.
But when you've got millions of users, breaking things is not an option.
And here's the thing. Even if a library is secure today, what about next week? You're at the mercy of their update schedule, their security practices, one missed vulnerability, one rogue dependency, and you're scrambling to patch your app while your users are left exposed.
So how do large teams even wrap their heads around this? I can't imagine they're reading every line of code in every library they use.
It's a multi-layered approach. First, rigorous vetting up front. You're looking for a proven security track record.
Like, are they transparent about past vulnerabilities? Do they even have a way to tell you about security alerts?
Exactly. And this is where that mobile platform team that Ross talks about comes in.
Okay, so at a certain scale, you need dedicated people who live and breathe this stuff.
Absolutely. People who get the intricacies of mobile security, who can assess the risk of a library not just on its own, but as part of your whole app ecosystem.
Because that innocent-looking animation library could be pulling in code that messes with your payment processor.
Exactly. It's about understanding those hidden connections. And it's not just about security either. Performance is huge. That lightweight library might be a memory hog on older devices.
Leading to
ANRs.
ANRs. For those of us who don't speak fluent Android.
Application not responding, that dreaded dialogue that pops up when your app freezes.
Oh, yeah. Users hate that.
And you'd be surprised how often it's a seemingly small library that's the culprit. Maybe one that wasn't optimized for older devices.
So even if it works fine on your brand new iPhone, it could be crashing and burning on someone else's older Android.
Bingo. And then there's fragmentation. What works on one device might be a disaster on another, especially in the Android world, with all the different manufacturers and OS versions.
Okay, so we've got security risks, performance pitfalls, anything else lurking in the depths of third-party code.
Oh yeah, updates. Imagine this. You built a core feature using Library X, everything's humming along. Then, bam, Library X pushes a breaking change.
You're kidding.
Maybe they deprecated an API you relied on. Maybe they restructured their entire code base.
And suddenly you're not just updating your app, you're rebuilding a chunk of it from scratch.
And praying that rebuild doesn't break a dozen other things in the process.
The bigger your app gets, the more this starts to feel like a house of cards.
It's true. And it can make teams terrified to update anything because who knows what might happen. But the longer you wait, the harder it gets.
So is the solution just to build everything yourself? Avoid third-party code completely? Well, that's tempting, right? Get some control back.
I get it.
But building everything from scratch, that's not really realistic for most companies.
Especially at scale, yeah. It's about finding a middle ground. And that's where Oros's advice is super helpful. He says to treat every library, every SDK, like a job applicant. You wouldn't hire someone without checking their references, right?
You'd definitely do more than one interview, especially for a critical role.
Exactly. So go beyond just what the library does. Look at their code on GitHub. What's their commit history look like? Is the code well organized, well documented? Are they responsive to issues?
You're basically looking for signs of a healthy project. If the last update was 3 years ago, that's a red flag.
Huge red flag. Oh, and don't underestimate the power of community. A library with an active community means better documentation, quicker bug fixes.
And less chance of it disappearing overnight, leaving you high and dry.
Exactly. Active forums, maybe a dedicated Slack or Discord. Those are good signs.
It means there's a whole ecosystem there, right? People invested in this library.
And that benefits everyone.
Okay, so let's say you've done your homework, found a library, it's secure, performs well, great community. Are you in the clear?
Hold on. Integrating third-party code, especially as your app grows, that's a whole other challenge.
Our skyscraper is back.
Right. It's easy for things to get messy. Every library has its own architecture, its own dependencies. You can end up with conflicting versions of the same dependency.
Oh, tell me about it. I once spent hours debugging an issue. Turned out it was just two libraries using slightly different versions of the same image loading library.
Classic. And that's why Oros is so big on modular architecture, especially as you scale.
Okay, break that down for me. Modular architecture. What is it, and why does it matter so much here?
Instead of your app being this massive blob of code, it's broken down into smaller, self-contained modules. Each one has a specific job, and they communicate through well-defined interfaces.
Like building blocks again, but for code?
You got it. And just like building blocks, you can swap one out without breaking the whole thing. So if you need to update a library, even replace it entirely, the impact is contained.
That sounds way less stressful than trying to untangle a giant mess of code.
Right. And this modular approach, it goes hand in hand with dependency injection.
Dependency injection. I feel like I hear that term all the time, but I'm not sure I could explain it.
It's simpler than it sounds. Instead of your modules being tightly coupled, meaning they directly create and depend on each other, you provide dependencies from the outside.
So instead of module A saying, I need module B, specifically this instance of it, it's more like, just give me something that does this, this, and this. I don't care where it comes from.
Exactly. And there are tools for this, Dagger for Android, Swinject for iOS. They help manage these dependencies in a clean way.
So with modular architecture, dependency injection, you're basically creating a system that's adaptable. You can swap those prefab parts out without the whole skyscraper collapsing.
Exactly. It takes more planning up front, but it makes your app so much more maintainable, so much more scalable in the long run.
It's like you're trying to future-proof this massive skyscraper, which, let's be real, is kind of impossible in the mobile world, right? Things change so fast.
True. But these architectural principles, they give you flexibility, a new library, new OS version, even just new expectations from users. You can adapt.
And that adaptability is everything when you're building for scale.
Speaking of which, Oris talks about another huge part of scaling that we haven't gotten to yet, experimentation.
Ah, yes, the heart of any good app. You're constantly testing new things, trying to figure out what users actually want. How does that work when you've got millions of people using your app?
It's less about gut feeling, more about data. You can't just throw a new feature out there and see what happens.
Yeah, the stakes are a little higher when you have that many users.
Way higher. That's where things like A/B testing, feature flags, gradual rollouts, all of that comes in.
Let's break those down a bit. A/B
Right.
testing, that's pretty standard, right? Showing different versions of something to different users, see what performs best.
Right, but at scale, it gets complicated fast. You might have dozens of experiments running at once, each one with tons of variations. You need serious tools just to keep track of it all.
And feature flags, how do those fit in?
Feature flags let you turn a feature on or off for certain users without having to release a whole new version of the app.
So you're testing it out with a small group first.
Exactly. Get feedback, iterate, all before most users even see it.
Very cool. And gradual rollouts, I'm guessing that's exactly what it sounds like, slowly releasing a feature to more and more people.
You got it. Dip your toes in the water before you cannonball in.
Minimizing the risk while still being able to move fast.
Exactly. And honestly, that's the big takeaway from all of this, from Oris's book. Scaling a mobile app, it's not just about writing more code. It's about building a whole system that can handle millions of users without sacrificing speed or quality or your sanity.
It's about making the right choices early on, setting yourself up for success, whether you're building for 1,000 users or 1,000,000 or 10 million.
Well said. Think big, start small, and never stop learning.
Words to live by for sure. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into mobile apps at scale. Hopefully you've picked up some useful tips and tricks along the way. We'll have links to all the tools and resources we talked about in the show notes, so check those out. Thanks for joining us, and happy scaling, everyone.